All right, can I get a thumbs up? The screen's looking okay? All right, thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today in person or tuning in to the recording. We are very excited to welcome you to our third quarter seminar series, which is going to focus on inclusive teaching practices. And this is the first of the sessions where we're going to talk about uncovering and mitigating implicit bias in health sciences education. And if I don't know you personally, I'm Julie, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. To set the stage for this presentation, I want to start with a riddle that was used in a video produced by Mindspace. I'm going to tell you this riddle, and I'm going to invite you to consider what you think the answer might be, but I'm not going to ask anyone to share out, so just feel free to think about it to yourself. Okay, here's the riddle. A father is about to bring his son to a job interview applying for a position at a large stockbroker's company in the city. Just as they arrive at the company's parking lot, the son's phone rings. He looks at his father, who says, "Go ahead and answer it." The caller is the trading company's CEO, who says, "Good luck, son, you've got this." The son ends the call and once again looks at his father, who's still next to him in the car. How is this possible? What do you think the solution to the puzzle is? Well, Mindspace asked a diverse group of 22 people to answer the riddle on video, and here are some of their responses. Is just an old man referring to this kid as son? The son has two fathers. The boy's name is Son. It's a recording that the father made to congratulate and welcome his son to this big, exciting day. Interestingly, none of the people guessed that the CEO was the boy's mother. When presented with the answer to the riddle, most people were shocked because it revealed to them how their initial mental picture of a CEO was a man, even for the woman who was being interviewed, who herself was a CEO. So we're going to put the link to that video in the chat and make it available in the recording. And I really hope you take some time to watch that 3-minute video later, because I think seeing this play out on camera is really interesting. Word puzzles like the one we just heard about the son and the CEO highlight how our brains are often playing instantaneous word association games that help to reveal how we all have implicit bias. Our biases can be different, but we do all have them. As we start this conversation, I want to ground it by publicly stating I'm on a learning journey about bias, as we all are. Even as I present today on this topic, I want to recognize I have bias like we all do, and I'm not perfect, and I'm not going to get it right all of the time. But I believe that this work of reflection, of learning and unlearning things that we've absorbed from society around us is really important. And I want to thank you for being here today or listening to the recording and being vulnerable about your own learning journey. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that the topics we discuss today are sensitive in nature and may impact people differently. I want to empower you to do what you need to do to feel safe, including turning off your camera, stepping away for a moment to take a break, or doing some grounding practices or any other techniques that work best for you. This topic can be highly personal, and so we'll use polling tools to allow you to ask anonymous questions throughout the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we'll discuss those questions together, or you can feel free to come off mute and ask those questions verbally once we stop the recording. For today's session, we have 3 goals. First, we'll talk about what implicit bias is and what it isn't, and a little bit about where it comes from. We'll talk about how implicit bias impacts us and others inside and outside of the classroom. And we'll conclude by exploring tips and strategies for reducing implicit bias in the teaching and learning context. So let's start now with goal 1. Here's a definition from the Perception Institute. They remind us that thoughts and feelings are implicit if we're unaware of them or are mistaken about their nature. And we have bias when, rather than being neutral, we have a preference for or an aversion to a person or group of people. So taking these ideas together, implicit bias is used to describe when we have attitudes toward people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. In fact, while it's common to talk about implicit bias when it comes to gender, race, ethnicity, class, we have unconscious attitudes about objects and concepts as well. The term implicit bias is attributed to psychologists Banaji and Greenwald and their scholarly work published in 1995. But implicit bias has existed for time immemorial, and it's just one type of bias that occurs in our brains. Think about it this way. The brain is constantly being inundated with information, about 11 million bits of information per second. So to help make sense of all of that, our brains make shortcuts using a variety of methods. In the case of implicit bias, it's important to note that the shortcuts the brain is making are not based in absolute truths, but they're rather they're informed by the environments in which we're born and in which we live. For example, even when not explicitly taught, research has shown that by the time a child is 5 years old, they already have developed implicit bias, including those about gender and race. So where did kids learn these biases? Well, the first place is by observing how others behave in social interactions, not only what they're saying, but also their body language and their vocal tone. Actually, research has also shown that children can pick up on the goals of people's behaviors, not just the outcomes. They're also learning cues from the media, from books and TV, from toys they've been exposed to, from print media like books and magazines. Who the children interact with can shape their biases and also their other aspects of their lived experiences. While I've talked here about children as these little social pattern detectors, I want to note that brains of any age engage in pattern detection, and that over time, information and misinformation continue to inform and ingrain themselves in our brains as implicit bias. While we all have these learned implicit biases, we also have our conscious thoughts that are shaped by our personal values and beliefs. However, as Cheryl Statz wrote in The American Educator, we're more likely to rely on those bias implicit associations when we're working under a time constraint, in a situation where we're working with or have been given ambiguous or incomplete information, and when our cognitive control is compromised, like when we're multitasking, overtired, or stressed. For example, in the case of the riddle and the video I mentioned at the beginning, people can strongly believe that women are every bit as capable as men at being excellent leaders. And still, under pressure or given the ambiguous scenario like a riddle, they may make those unconscious associations that a man is more likely to be a CEO. So we want to distinguish between our unconscious and our conscious thoughts. We also want to distinguish between implicit bias and explicit and systemic biases. Having an automatic association of men with CEOs doesn't mean that someone is sexist or is a bad person. But sexism exists both at the individual and systemic levels. Explicit bias includes both conscious attitudes and displayed behaviors, like treating people differently or excluding people based on one or multiple aspects of their identity. Remember that our systems were created and are maintained by people who had and have their own biases, both implicit and explicit. Therefore, we have bias in our systems and our institutions. The Oxford reference describes systemic or institutional bias as a tendency for the procedures and practices of particular institutions to operate in ways which result in certain social groups being advantaged or favored and others being disadvantaged or devalued. This need not be the result of any conscious prejudice or discrimination, but rather of the majority simply following existing rules or norms. So now that we've defined some of these terms, let's move into goal 2. From our context as a health sciences university, I want to mention that implicit bias can have impacts on everyone in the system, including patients, clinicians, faculty and staff, and students. But for the purposes of today's conversation, let's focus specifically on implicit bias in the teaching and learning context, and we'll explore this idea looking at a few scenarios. I'd first like to recount a story told by Dr. Christina Mitchell on the Tea for Teaching podcast. Dr. Mitchell, a woman, described how she and a colleague who was a man noticed anecdotally that the types of emails they got from students varied pretty drastically. Dr. Mitchell tended to get emails asking for exemptions, extensions, and sympathy, while her colleague, who was a graduate student at the time, didn't seem to be getting those same types of emails. So they decided to test that, and they looked both at the formal end of course evaluations using the university provided form, and they also looked at informal evaluations that students were sharing on ratemyprofessor.com. And because they taught different courses, they weren't asking whether he was a better teacher than her. They were really looking at the language, themes in the language that students were using to talk about their instructors. For example, did the students talk about the instructor's personality? Did they mention appearance or what the instructor was wearing? Did they talk about their competence? How did they refer to their instructors? When they ran the stats, they saw that students were more likely to talk about the doctoral student instructor's competence and his qualifications, and he was more likely to be referred to as professor, even though he had not yet completed his doctoral training. Whereas Dr. Mitchell's comments referred to her personality and her appearance rather than her expertise, and the comments more often referred to her as teacher rather than professor. A plethora of other studies have validated the findings that Dr. Mitchell shared, that students' implicit biases can impact the ratings they give their faculty members. The story I shared here is on gender, but other studies have seen similar effects related to race and ethnicity, where faculty of color received lower ratings of their teaching compared to their white colleagues, accents of faculty, attire, where how faculty dressed impacts their SRT results, and other factors, including beauty standards. These results highlight implicit biases that students have about their faculty and their perceptions of their faculty's competence and knowledge. This can, of course, have short-term impacts on faculty's job satisfaction and motivation, but also long-term impacts too, because these assessments are often used for promotion and tenure. So the implicit biases can be directly impacting faculty's careers. That was a bit about how student bias can impact their perspectives on their faculty, but what about the other way around? This story is actually from an experience I had as a college student, and I'm not going to reveal any identifying information here, but I have a very powerful recollection of sitting in a giant lecture hall for one of my gen ed classes, the class meeting right after a big exam. The instructor came in and was really disappointed in the overall results of the exam scores from the class. And the instructor proceeded to go through the questions to review them, and we got to one in particular where they thought we all should have aced the question. So they asked the class what went wrong, and someone proceeded to tell them that the way the question was written was confusing because it had some grammatical and copy editing errors. So if you read the question one way, you would have made one set of assumptions, used a set of values, and gotten one particular answer. And if you read it a different way, you would have made different assumptions and gotten a completely different answer. Well, the teacher started getting pretty defensive and fairly angrily asked if someone would read the question out loud to help them understand the issue. Few hands were raised, and the professor looked at one of the students and said, "Not you, I want to hear from a native English speaker." And a really palpable energy of discomfort went through the class. This memory really has resonated with me as a strong reminder that we can't look at someone and know very much about them, even though our implicit biases might be working behind the scenes to try to categorize people into groups. Now, I certainly wouldn't presume to tell this peer of mine who offered to read the sentence out loud how they felt about that experience. But I know from times where assumptions have been made about me by other people, it can have strong impacts not only on how I feel in that moment, but how I act in the future. Implicit biases we have about our students or our colleagues not only may cause them to feel uncomfortable, it can lead them to feel disconnected or to believe that they don't belong in a group or a setting. Thinking back to the student that I mentioned, after this encounter, they may have felt uncomfortable approaching the professor with questions or asking for support, like through office hours. That in turn could have impacted their academic performance, not to mention that when people don't feel like people believe they can succeed, they often perform more poorly. This can in turn lead to burnout and people leaving the program or even the profession. Now, some of you may know that my background is in biomedical engineering, and I sometimes heard conversations in the engineering space about how students would switch majors out of engineering to other disciplines. And sometimes this was talked about as how these students just couldn't hack it. There are a lot of reasons that someone might switch disciplines, but I often felt the way this conversation was had was really a way of putting blame on especially minoritized students for not being resilient enough to push through the implicit and explicit personal and systemic biases that they were encountering, rather than doing the hard, reflective work to consider what barriers may have been put in the student's way, either intentionally or unintentionally. And quite frankly, people leaving the discipline means that the discipline itself missed out. It missed out on benefiting from these students' knowledge, perspectives, and ideas. So we need to be very careful because our implicit biases can push some people down and uplift others. To quickly illustrate this, I want to adapt an image that's been used by Pamela Fuller, and others to talk about implicit or unconscious bias. This graphic illustrates that implicit and explicit biases can be overtly damaging to people's emotional, physical, and mental well-being. While sometimes less obvious or less overt, our biases can also be limiting to people. When people are ignored or feel like they're only being tolerated, it can decrease their sense of belonging and motivation, and it can limit their contributions to the team, which can, of course, have negative impacts on people's well-being. Alternatively, our biases can lead us to treat some people more positively than others, to treat them more automatically with respect, to make them feel included and valued. When we work to address our biases, we can actively behave in ways that make everyone feel respected, included, and valued. So there are countless vignettes I could have shared here, but I hope that these two begin to illustrate that not only do we all have implicit bias, we're all impacted in a myriad of ways by implicit bias. So recognizing that, what are some strategies we can use for addressing implicit bias? I love the phrase, we don't know what we don't know. The 3 Rs is a version of that for implicit bias. When you have an immediate reaction or after you had the reaction, pause to recognize it. Reflect on whether it's actually how you feel. Does the immediate response really align with your values and beliefs? And then think about how you'll respond in the situation or how you'll respond next time. Another tool to help us uncover our own unconscious associations is a tool called the Implicit Association Tests, or IATs. These are a widely used tool that are basically designed to test how quickly you associate concepts and terms. The underlying theory here is that the more strongly you associate two ideas, the quicker you'll be able to group those things together. There are a lot of free IATs on the internet that you can take, and I think they're really informative to see your own results. For example, I identify as a woman in STEM, and it was really powerful for me to see how I had implicit associations that more strongly associated men with being scientists. Like we talked about before, this doesn't mean that I'm anti-woman in STEM. It means that I hold implicit biases that have been based on the context in which I grew up. Lastly, our worldviews are informed by what we've experienced and heard about others' experiences. When we interact with a diverse group of people, we gain new perspectives. Of course, it's important that these are personal interactions, but I don't want to discount the value of media for helping us to learn about others' lived experiences. For example, whose books do you read? Whose podcasts or music do you listen to? Who do you see on your Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok? Don't get me wrong, social media has a lot of negative impacts, but it can help us to learn from people all over the world in some really unique ways. So the last slide talked a little bit about some techniques for recognizing and mitigating biases that we might employ for ourselves. But I'd like to share a few tips for teaching and learning environments specifically. One tool you might think about is how you set up expectations for assessments in your teaching. Using clear rubrics helps to reduce the opportunity for our unconscious biases to inform our grading decisions. Similarly, Canvas offers several options for hiding students' names when grading assignments. We'll share a little bit more about this tool in the chat and we'll put it on the YouTube channel as well. But essentially, students' names are not shown in SpeedGrader when you use this approach, so it can help to reduce unintentional bias in grading as well. Using case studies and role plays are very common and very powerful tools in health sciences. But it's important that we pick scenarios intentionally, such that we're not reinforcing negative stereotypes and the scenarios are not re-traumatizing for students. A last suggestion I want to offer here are strategies for calling out and calling in. As educators, we are responsible for cultivating environments that are safe for learning. Part of that is knowing when we need to step in and disrupt behavior, and alternatively, when we might have an opportunity for a teaching moment. Tufts has a great resource about this topic that they adapted from sources, including the Oregon Center for Educational Equity. In just a moment, we'll share this resource, and I'd like to point out a few things from it. They note that calling out is important when we need to let someone know that their words or actions are unacceptable and will not be tolerated, or when we need to interrupt in order to prevent further harm. In doing so, we might use phrases like, I need to push back against that, I disagree, I don't see it that way. Or, it sounds like you're making some assumptions that we need to unpack a bit. Or even, wow, nope, ouch, I need to stop you right there. This will likely feel hard and uncomfortable. but it's necessary to stop aggression that might be targeted towards you or to be an ally if you're hearing them being used towards others. Calling in is appropriate in a different set of circumstances, like when there's an opportunity to explore an idea and find a mutual sense of understanding across difference. Here you might use phrases like, I'm curious, what was your intention when you said that? Or what do you think others might say, think, or feel? Why do you believe that to be the case? Or why do you believe that to be true? In our classrooms and even in our personal lives, we might think about how we can leverage both of these techniques. For example, how might we call out behaviors and call in people as individuals? As we conclude today, I want to leave you with the idea of calling out and calling in. Remember that we all have implicit bias, but we can actively work to be conscious of engaging with our unconscious. If you notice yourself thinking or behaving in a certain way, that's a great opportunity to pause and reflect, to think about where that behavior or thought came from. Do you agree with it consciously? Does it align with your values? How has that been informed by the environment and the experiences that you've had? How can you learn from that and do different next time? In the handout we're going to give you, we're offering a tool that can help with that process. But I want to recognize that this is a lifelong endeavor. It can be hard and uncomfortable work, but it's important work to better serve our communities, our patients, our students, and our colleagues. So we encourage you to start small by examining one interaction at a time and reflect on your own automatic assumptions and challenge your biases. Thank you so much for your time and attention. In just a moment, we'll stop the recording and open it up to any questions that have come through either through Slido or if you'd like to add them to the chat. But before we do that, I want to remind you about the upcoming sessions in our series. This time next week, we'll hear about advancing inclusive excellence, enhancing support for diverse learners in health sciences. And then later in September, we'll hear our third and final session in the series, Bridging Cultures in Education, Effective Culturally Responsive Teaching Practices. So we're here at the beginning. All of these series presentations will be available through live presentations, and also the recordings will be made available on our YouTube channel. Like I mentioned, we're going to leave you with a handout that provides additional information about the topics that we talked about today, but I also want to share that the following avenues are available to you if you wish to seek additional support, including Anthem's Employee Assistance Program, or EAP, which offers a variety of services, including counseling and support, as well as our HR team, who's here to assist you with any questions or support that you may need. So thank you so much for your time and attention. Quince, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind stopping the recording, and we'll open the floor to any questions here for the last couple.